I didn't know that when I walked out of that house, I wouldn't come back. But one thing I knew for certain, everything I had done was for both of us. For our life together. As it turned out, his life and his family weren't ready for me to start living by my own rules. Now, they would have to pay for their greed, and I didn't yet understand how high the cost would be. But one thing was clear, the game was only just beginning. My name is Anne, I'm 34 years old, and I'm a housewife. Jason and I have been married for 5 years, and during all this time, not a single day passed without thoughts of the future, which I sorted through every day like cards laid out on a table. We have no children, and I've never felt this as sharply as I have in recent years. We live alone in a small, cozy house on the outskirts of the city, far from the hustle and bustle. This place became our world, our rules, and our boundaries. We were always just a couple. But that doesn't mean it was simple. After college, Jason got a job at a company where, as it turned out, working was a real ordeal. The company promised good conditions, but in reality, everything was much harder. He had to work from early morning until late at night, often staying in the office on weekends. I remember how he would come home exhausted, drained, with the same unresolved, pressing problems etched on his face that only deepened with each passing day. His body and mind were worn out, and I couldn't watch it without feeling a growing unease. During those moments, I felt my life becoming empty and incomplete. Not that I lacked purpose for the two of us. He was living his life, and I was living mine. So, I decided to take a step forward and try to find a way to put my own abilities to use. I understood that if I could be useful to Jason, it wouldn't just be support, it would be an opportunity for both of us to survive in this relentless rhythm. I started looking for work I could do from home. At first, it wasn't anything remarkable. I took on data entry tasks that could be described as routine, requiring no special effort. The work was boring but far less demanding than Jason's job, and I understood it was only the beginning. Something greater was on the horizon. Day by day, I became more engrossed in this work. I began looking for ways to improve my skills, to learn something new. And then, one day, after many evenings spent on online courses, I started working on video editing. It was a true breakthrough, unexpected but no less exciting. I hadn't thought it would captivate me so much. The tools, the effects, the idea of creating something new that had once seemed so distant and unattainable. I felt like I was opening a new door in life. At first, I took small jobs that didn't require much effort, but every task completed became more than just a source of income, it became a stepping stone. I felt my experience growing, my confidence building. But I couldn't stop there. I started reading books on video editing, keeping up with new trends, analyzing feedback, and studying the work of other editors. My videos became more polished, which attracted more clients. That's when I realized I could work and earn as much as I might at a part-time, normal job. But most importantly, I could do it from home, free from stress and endless reports. This opened up entirely new horizons for me, and I started thinking about how I could help Jason. After all, if I could earn more, perhaps he could cut back on his working hours, couldn't he? My efforts weren't in vain. Over time, I started earning more than I had expected. But most importantly, I no longer felt like just a housewife. I felt like a full-fledged individual with my own ambitions and goals. I learned to save, to manage finances, and soon there was money I could invest. And I couldn't help but think about how much could be achieved with consistent and confident action. At first, these were small investments, stocks that seemed appropriate for a beginner. Gradually, I increased the sums, learning from both mistakes and successes. It was a long and not always easy process, but I felt myself growing. Every successful step bolstered my confidence. And soon I realized that all my efforts were forming into something bigger than just an income. I was creating a system that could support our family. When Jason and I had dinner in the evenings, I tried not to discuss work. He was tired, while I was brimming with energy like never before. But one day, as we sat at the table, I felt it was time to share what I had achieved. And honestly, I was scared. I didn't know how he would react to the fact that I had done all this without his involvement, without his advice. But I needed him to know. Jason, I began, and he looked up. He looked the same as always after a long day, slightly distracted but with a hint of curiosity in his eyes. I'm also glad that I can help if it makes Jason even a little happier. After all, his happiness is my happiness too. If I can be there for him, support him, and help him battle his work demons, then maybe it will even bring us closer together. I hoped that my efforts would strengthen our relationship as a couple, make it more resilient, because we always told each other that together is forever. Too often, those words remain just words, but I truly believed that with us, it would be different. But, as often happens in life, reality throws its own challenges at you. Our relationship took an unexpected turn, and I wasn't prepared for everything to become so unstable. One evening, Jason came home, sat down on the couch without even taking off his shoes, as if carrying a heavy burden on his shoulders. He remained silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, I could sense something in his voice that went beyond mere exhaustion. It was something deeper, something that couldn't have been expressed in words, if not for what he said next. "Hey, could we move in with my parents?" For a moment, I was taken aback. Move? To this parents' house? I couldn't fathom how this idea had even crossed his mind. Jason and I had grown so accustomed to our small, cozy world, to the home we had lovingly created, and the thought of leaving it felt distant, alien. Wait, hold on a minute. Are you saying we're moving into your parents' house? I asked, trying to gather my thoughts. He sighed, as if he had anticipated this question, and shook his head. You know, even if you switched jobs, we could easily live off what I make, he said with a strange sense of confidence, as though he was trying to convince not me, but himself. We don't need to move into my parents' house. No, that's not what I meant. I was puzzled, but his next words left me utterly shocked. He continued, and there was a kind of quiet determination in his voice, as if he had already made the decision for both of us. I mean, we could rent a room in a new apartment, and we could all live together. Here, take a look. Jason handed me a flyer he had just picked up from the mailbox. It featured a gleaming tower of glass and concrete, showcasing shiny, modern apartments with a view of the city. What do you think about living there? I hesitated. There was something unsettling in his words. We could rent a room in this shiny new building, but what did that mean for us? What were we really trying to do? How were we planning to build our life in a place like that when things had always been simpler before? Jason pressed on. I could finally take better care of my parents this way, he said, seemingly oblivious to my doubts. His words sounded like a vow he had already made. I felt my heart tighten with worry. I had never felt so lost, so out of touch with what was happening. He had always been like this, but his proposal now placed us on a path that felt too fast, too unexpected. No, wait a minute, I interrupted, my heart pounding. The rent is $5,000. That's way too expensive for us, Jason. We can't afford that. He looked at me with confusion, then his expression turned resolute. I saw in his eyes that he was ready to sacrifice his comfort for this step. But I couldn't understand what was driving him to insist on this move. We had always lived modestly, and this sudden leap into luxury felt so unlike us. This doesn't have to cost that much, Anne, he said quietly, as if trying to convince himself. We'll find ways to cut expenses, but I'm sure we can manage. It's just the beginning. I sat in silence, his words spinning in my head. Throughout our life together, we had never taken such drastic steps, and despite his confidence, I could feel everything starting to come apart at the seams. Too much uncertainty, Too many variables. I wasn't ready to upend my entire life for something that felt like a temporary, incomplete solution. Jason clumsily told his parents that the rent for this room hadn't been paid yet. He was clearly flustered, his voice trembling as it always did when he struggled to present something important, something that might change everything. He looked at his parents, likely trying to gauge their reaction and what this decision might mean for them. But as soon as he said those words, I realized that this wasn't just a financial issue. It had become a test of our entire family dynamic. When his parents heard that the rent would be paid not from his salary but from my investment income, they were visibly taken aback. I could see them struggling to process this information. Their faces grew tense, their eyes frozen in place. In their minds, Jason had always been the provider, the one who was supposed to support us, the head of our family. And now I, as the wife earning money, had suddenly become the focal point of this new reality. "Oh, that's Anne's earnings," his mother exclaimed, clearly stunned. Her voice carried a mix of surprise, disapproval, and confusion. "I didn't know you were managing so well." I noticed his father crossing his arms and glancing at both of us with a perplexed expression before finally turning his gaze to me, as if trying to figure out who I really was. Things had been simpler before. They had always seen Jason as the reliable man, and now, with me at the center of this conversation, I felt the tension mounting. It was as though I had been thrust into an unfamiliar role, the one keeping the family afloat. To be honest, I was a little embarrassed by the situation too. Jason and I had always tried to avoid raising such issues in front of his parents because we wanted them to see us as a couple capable of handling life's challenges. But when he told them the truth, I felt everything shift. It was necessary, yes, but still, it was as if I had been dragged into the center of a storm I hadn't anticipated. I noticed how his parents initially remained silent, unsure of what to say. Eventually, they began apologizing, especially to me. I could feel their genuine regret about how things had turned out. Honestly, it made me feel a little uncomfortable. I didn't want them to feel awkward, especially not with me. We had always considered each other family, and I wasn't about to disrupt that comfort. I felt my cheeks flush slightly and realized I needed to smooth over the awkwardness. Taking a deep breath, I quietly said, "Please, don't worry. I didn't start investing to prove anything or to change the dynamic. I just wanted to help Jason, who works so hard at his job. I thought that if I could contribute, if my efforts could improve our lives, it would be better for all of us." I paused, hoping my words would be understood, and then continued. "And really, I've always believed it's better to support one another than to live under constant tension. This is also a way to take care of Jason, to help him feel more at ease, so he doesn't have to carry the entire responsibility on his own." After my words, they both seemed to relax slightly, though they still looked a bit uncertain, especially his mother. But I was relieved that Jason had told them the truth now, rather than later, when there would have been no way to hide it. I could sense that this honesty might ease his mind, even just a little. However, what happened next brought a new tension into the air. The entire situation, with money, investments, and me earning, pushed me out of the framework of what I had always considered normal. I had never seen myself as a provider. I was just a woman who wanted to support her husband, never thinking that these efforts might cause discomfort for others. Yet, despite my attempts to smooth things over, his parents continued to look at me with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Then suddenly, Jason spoke again. "You know, I thought it would be easier if we rented a room in a new apartment to be closer to you. That way, I could really take care of my parents, and it would make everything simpler." I fell silent. I had prepared myself for many twists and turns, but not this. I felt a surge of inner tension. Had I ever imagined sitting here, listening to Jason talk about taking care of his parents by renting an apartment? The idea struck me as strange and even absurd, and something inside me rang with alarm. I looked at him, unsure how to respond. Jason, who had always loved fashion, was thrilled to finally be in a position to spend money on his appearance, his desires, and his hobbies. For him, new things weren't just purchases, they were a form of self-expression. He was meticulous about it, just as he was about anything he wanted to excel in. He could spend hours in stores, examining every detail and experimenting with styles. Clothing wasn't just fabric to him, it was a way to be himself, or sometimes, to be someone else entirely. And when his soul craved something new, he never hesitated to indulge. I had grown used to it. His independence in managing his money had become a part of our lives. He wasn't shy about doing what he always did, following his desires. After all, he worked hard to earn his money, and it seemed fair that he could spend it however he pleased. But one day, during one of these conversations, he made a suggestion that caught me off guard. "Why don't you go buy something for my parents?" he said, sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee in hand, his eyes sparkling with what he clearly thought was a reasonable idea. "It's part of taking care of them." I froze for a moment, processing his words. He always suggested doing things for his parents as if it were my responsibility, not his. But honestly, the idea didn't sit well with me. I understood the importance of caring for one's parents, but something about his request made me feel that this care wasn't entirely sincere. He wasn't against me buying clothes or other things for them, but he didn't involve himself. It felt like it was all on me, even though he could easily afford to do it himself. "Why don't you do it for them?" I replied, not hiding my disappointment. "You're the one who now has the freedom to manage your salary. Why don't you show your care for them? You have the means for it now." His expression changed immediately. I noticed how his gaze hardened and his breathing grew heavier. He wasn't prepared for such bluntness. I knew that if he truly cared about his parents, he would take an active role in this. But instead, he wanted me to do it for him. His word was final when it came to matters involving his parents, and the moment I began to resist, he seemed entirely out of his element. He frowned, and a shadow of irritation crossed his face. "Why can't you just help?" he said, clearly not understanding why I was pushing back. "It's not that hard." I knew that in this moment, his ego had taken a hit. He wanted me to do it so that he could avoid responsibility while still maintaining his own luxuries and lifestyle. He couldn't bring himself to care for his parents without sacrificing his own indulgences. And it was strange, he seemed to be playing the role of a caring son, but without truly participating in it. I couldn't agree to such a distortion of values. "If you want to take care of your parents, do it yourself, Jason. You can afford it. You're free now, so why not take on that responsibility?" His face fell, and in that moment, I realized he didn't know how to respond to my words. My suggestion was simple, but it uncovered something significant. He wasn't prepared to share this responsibility. And when I refused to fulfill his request, he suddenly faced a choice he hadn't anticipated. The following days were tense. Jason didn't bring up buying things for his parents again. But in his eyes, I could see a growing discontent. It hurt to watch him try to hide it, but his irritation was becoming more and more obvious. When he could no longer mask it with silence, he started dragging out conversations, and his mood turned increasingly sullen. No matter how much I tried to justify my decision to myself, that I simply couldn't keep doing what he expected of me, his growing distance continued to weigh on me. With every refusal, I felt our bond beginning to fray. After that, my in-laws started speaking with Jason behind my back when I wasn't around. I can't pinpoint exactly when I first felt the gap forming between us, but the feeling kept growing. Their voices were loud, and I could hear them talking about me whenever they gathered in the living room. Sometimes, when I passed by, it felt as though they raised their voices on purpose, ensuring I overheard their discussions. And though I tried not to eavesdrop, I still heard them. It wasn't accidental. "Who does she think she is?" came Frank's voice, one of Jason's closest relatives. "Does she think she's better than us? So strange how she's changed." Yes, she's become so full of herself, added his sister. All this talk about money, and just because she made some from gambling. It's ridiculous. I held my breath, standing in the doorway, trying not to reveal my presence. Their words hit me like hammers, but I couldn't tear myself away. Not that I'm proud of it, Frank continued, but if she can make that much money gambling, why can't we try too? We could learn and invest in FX or something like that, right? Yeah, exactly, we could do that too, Jason chimed in, though his voice lacked conviction. It sounded as if he was agreeing just to please them. Maybe we should start doing it right now. I felt the blood rush to my temples. Gambling and investing were two entirely different things, and comparing them was blasphemous. Gambling was taking a risk on chance, where you might win or lose everything. Investing, on the other hand, was about long-term decisions requiring knowledge, patience, and strategy. I hadn't done this for the thrill. I had seen it as a way to create the stability Jason and I had been seeking for so long. I wasn't foolish, I wasn't gambling on luck. I studied, analyzed, and made decisions based on facts and information. But as soon as my in-laws began equating my success with luck, something inside me broke. They didn't understand how deeply I had immersed myself in this process, how much effort I had poured into achieving what I had. What hurt me most was the claim that I was mocking them. I had never tried to appear better than they were. I simply believed that if I could do something beneficial for myself and Jason, why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I use my skills to improve our life together? I felt my fingers clench into fists, and a wave of irritation surged in my chest. But I couldn't afford to appear weak. I knew I needed to stay calm if I wanted to address this situation, and I couldn't let myself succumb to anger. Instead, I walked to the door and quietly opened it, stepping into the room. Jason was sitting on the couch, his expression tired, but he avoided meeting my eyes, as if he knew I had overheard everything. "Did you say something to them?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm, though my voice sounded restrained, almost cold. He sighed, unsure where to begin. He bit his lip, but I didn't let him continue. "You shouldn't have done this, Jason. You knew how much effort I put into this. You knew I wasn't just gambling with money." He was silent, unable to respond. I noticed how his shoulders slumped, as though the weight of everything that had happened had finally settled on him. I didn't blame him for revealing to them what I was doing, but it infuriated me that he hadn't defended me. Instead, he just sat there, as though this conversation had nothing to do with him, or with us. I had expected more from him, more support, more understanding. "You let them think this is just a game, Jason. And they don't realize how much I've invested to make our finances what they are now. You know this isn't luck, it's the result of hard work." He finally looked up at me, his expression almost fearful, as though he had just grasped how upset I truly was. I couldn't stay silent any longer. The weight of the situation bore down on me, and I couldn't stop the tears, even though I didn't want to show my vulnerability. "You know what bothers me the most?" I lifted my eyes to meet his gaze. "I'm not worried about us, not about our future. I'm worried that you don't believe in me, that you don't understand what I'm doing. And that hurts the most." I kept asking myself why I even had to do this. Why had all these expectations placed on me become so overwhelming? Why were my efforts, meant to help, seen as something alien and irritating? I had tried to support Jason, to help him through his struggles, to offer him my strength. And now, my attempts had become the source of tension and discord. At some point, I simply stopped. No more justifications, no more attempts to defend my actions. My efforts were being seen as a betrayal, and I could no longer carry that burden. I decided that if they couldn't accept me, if I didn't fit into their expectations, I had to step away from it all. My in-laws were furious with me. I could feel it in every word they spoke, in every glance they threw my way. No amount of reasoning or explanation made any difference. Their judgment was firm and unyielding. Jason was angry too. His gaze had grown cold, his words sharp. He didn't hide his disappointment, and even when he tried to stay calm, I could see his patience wearing thin. More and more, his eyes looked like empty voids, and his voice became increasingly distant. One day, when I approached him with yet another request or explanation, he looked at me as if he didn't know who I was and said, "With your behavior lately, everything you do, everything you say, it just makes me angry. You've been too confident for a wife. Mom and Dad are right, you're getting carried away. Don't you understand what's happening?" He made no effort to hide his anger, and his words hit me like precise, painful blows. There wasn't an ounce of empathy or understanding in his tone. It was a cold, calculated stab. And then Beth, Jason's sister, always bold and relentless, jumped in. "I hate everything about you," she declared, her face flushed. "And what are you even doing? Do you even know? You're changing, and not for the better. You become so distant, so alien." Those words hit me differently, making me feel unwanted, as though I'd lost everything that had once been mine. In that moment, as I looked around at them, at this family, at this house, at the relationships that once seemed solid and stable, I realized I no longer belonged here. I had been pushed out of their world, a piece that no longer fit. When Beth's voice began to rise, Jason sat silently, his face growing harder, his words cutting like a verdict. "You need to leave," he said, and it wasn't a request, it was an order. "Right now. You're no longer part of our family." I was stunned. For a moment, the world around me froze, and then, as if in slow motion, I felt the weight of his declaration fill me with emptiness. I looked at Jason, at his face, at his eyes filled with irritation but devoid of the affection they once held. He was no longer the man I had loved. And despite the pain, I understood that my feelings didn't matter anymore. He had made his decision. I stood there in the shadows, like a spectator, as if all of this was happening to someone else. All this time, I had tried to support them, to be part of their world, but now I was an outsider, an unwanted presence. And strangely, in that moment, I felt something breaking inside me. But it wasn't a shattered spirit, it was liberation. Jason seemed ready for this moment. He stood up, picked up some documents from the table, and handed them to me without meeting my eyes. "Sign these," he said, as if it were just another step in his endless string of demands. "Hurry up, let's get it over with." I looked at the papers and then at his face. Knowing that I had to sign them, that this was the final step in our shared journey, filled me with a strange mix of emptiness and freedom. It wasn't what I wanted, but it seemed there was no other choice. "Fine," I said, taking the papers and beginning to sign my part. It was a harsh decision, but it was necessary. Then I turned and headed to my room to pack my things. My emotions were a whirlwind: disappointment, anger, relief. I couldn't quite grasp what I was feeling, but I knew that everything was about to change. Too much had been said and done to go back. Too much was broken. I had wanted to tell them that investing wasn't instant wealth. It was a long and difficult path, one that required making mistakes, learning from them, and gaining knowledge. Knowledge that provided not only a theoretical foundation but also practical tools that needed to be applied carefully and thoughtfully. It wasn't a path that would yield immediate profit. It could be expensive, and sometimes you could lose more than you gained. But I still believed it could have been a valuable lesson for Jason and his parents, to learn how to invest and plan for their financial future. It could have been an opportunity that might have shaped their lives in a meaningful way. But in that moment, I didn't feel like offering advice anymore. I was tired. I had no energy left to explain, to persuade, or to justify myself, to them or even to myself. I stayed silent, no longer trying to convey the depth of my thoughts. I just decided to leave. That was my decision. I told them that and then headed toward the front door. As I stepped across the threshold, I could feel their eyes following me, their presence unbearably heavy. They didn't try to stop me, but I could sense how painful this moment was for them. I hadn't expected it to end this way, but perhaps this was exactly how it was meant to be. The moment I stepped outside, Jason and his family reacted instinctively, unable to reconcile themselves to my departure. They veered off their path to follow me, and I couldn't ignore Jason's voice cutting through the silence, tinged with desperation and veiled aggression. "Now I want you to disrespect me. I'll be more successful than you," he said, his words slicing into me like knives. But I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I ignored them, stepping into the dark evening without pity or fear. I knew I had to move forward now. There was no place for me in that house anymore. I returned to my parents' home, hoping it would be a refuge where I could find some peace. But even there, in that familiar and comforting place, I couldn't shake the memory of that moment, Jason and his family letting me go with such scorn and bitterness in their voices. I wasn't prepared for it, but perhaps that moment was my salvation. Later, through my lawyer, I filed for alimony against Jason and his mistress. There were no tears, no remorse. I knew this was the only way to make them understand that I wouldn't just stand idly by. I demanded that Jason take full responsibility for the divorce and insisted there be no division of property. I wanted no further ties to that house, that family, or the man who had once meant so much to me. My lawyer told me they seemed as though they could afford everything I demanded, and to my surprise, they agreed to pay me in full immediately. They accepted the no property division clause. Perhaps they thought it was the best option for everyone, but for me, it wasn't just an ending, it was the beginning of something new. Maybe they had a skilled negotiator among them. The deal they made seemed significant to me, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were simply buying my silence. It was like a transaction that allowed everyone to move forward without looking back. As I stood on the threshold of this new chapter, I realized I finally had the chance to become the person I was meant to be. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I stood at the doorway, ready to leave, and it hit me. Everything had already fallen apart for good. I no longer bore any responsibility for their mistakes, their decisions, or their debts. That was on them now, and as I finally took charge of my own life, everything else was their problem. I no longer wanted to be tied to their failures. My desire to fix their situation had vanished, along with the sense that I owed them anything. "It's your responsibility now," I said, taking one final step toward the door. "You'll have to take care of your parents yourself. Goodbye." I hung up the phone and felt a strange relief wash over me as I finally exited their world, though I couldn't quite grasp how quickly it had all ended. Our conversations no longer held any meaning. I had left it all behind. Later, a mutual friend told me that after I left, Jason and his family still found a way to continue their game, despite mounting debts. They tried to pull off another trading deal, but, as is often the case, it failed, and now they found themselves another $30,000 in debt. It wasn't just a setback, it was a plunge into the deepest financial abyss. When I heard about it, it became clear to me, nothing had changed. They were making the same mistakes, chasing goals beyond their means, and failing all over again. Their beloved apartment in the tower was foreclosed because it had been rented under Jason's name. It was almost laughable, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I had left all of this far behind, and now their problems, their debts, their failures were just background noise. Jason and his family were buried in debt, and he was forced to pour all his income into paying it off. It seemed like an unrelenting cycle. They were lost again, and no one could help them find their way out. Meanwhile, my life moved forward. I was no longer the person who made excuses for others' mistakes. I wasn't trying to explain, to find ways to help. It was clear to me that they had made their choices, and now they had to deal with the consequences, even if it meant Jason working from morning to night, living the kind of life he once despised. That was his life now. I couldn't be part of it anymore. It was expected that his parents would work too, to pay off their debts, which seemed fair enough. Their children, their mistakes. I felt no sympathy. I couldn't understand why I should worry about people who were unwilling to change their lives, who repeatedly fell into the same traps. Now they knew what investing was. They understood its cost, its true nature. No matter how hard they tried or what experience they sought, the result was always the same. But it didn't matter anymore. I was no longer part of their world. And honestly, I didn't care what happened to them next. All I could do was leave, close the door behind me, and move on with my life.